a wonderful living and supporting my family. But I saw the music industry changing, and what was I going to do? So one of the reasons I'm here today is because my background was in pop music, and I was a writer for a publishing company. And so what I was taught when I started professionally was, you write, Frank, for the world, right? And this has helped me so much, because later on when I got to Broadway, which is kind of the next chapter of my life I'll talk about, I learned in New York and on Broadway, they don't write for the world. If I put 9 Broadway composers, some of which are very good friends of mine, and me standing here, the thing that makes me very different from them is that they'll say the world is 7 blocks in New York City. And anything that happens after that is fine or not fine. We don't really care. But because I grew up over here as a writer for a pop publisher who always said, Frank, 60 to 70% of your income for the rest of your life will be coming from international sources, and it'll also make your life much richer. So I was always open to that. And I didn't even know when I got into Broadway, which by the way was a total accident, which I'll tell you, and I stumbled into Broadway. So I always had a different background. And I hope there's some people who want to write in here, want to be composers or want to create shows, yes? Some people want to do that? Great. Well, write for the world, Don't just write for down the block, And so that kind of made me different from the very beginning, And so now we're in the early 90s, and, I got some opportunities to do some theater. And really what happened was I met a man named Leslie Brickus, who really, Leslie actually just celebrated his 85th birthday, and he really was my mentor, my guiding force. He's one of the great songwriters in the world. Among his amazing accomplishments, he's won the Oscar, the Academy Award 3 times. He wrote a lot of the early James Bond themes. He wrote Goldfinger, You Only Live Twice. Amazing. You guys know Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory? He wrote all of that. He created all of that. So when you sing Oompa Loompa or Candyman, that's Leslie. Dr. Dolittle, Talk to the Animals, that's all Leslie, right? He won the Academy Award also for Victor Victoria with Julie Andrews, the great Julie Andrews. And then, if you're old enough, and even if you're not, you should know these songs. He wrote these 2 shows. One is called Stop the World, I Want to Get Off. And another show he wrote is called The Roar of the Grease Paint, The Smell of the Crowd. I have no idea how that's translating, but that's the name of that show. And out of those shows came gigantic hit songs, especially in America and in London. What Kind of Fool Am I? Who Can I Turn To? Once in a Lifetime, Gonna Build a Mountain. These are giant, they're not just hits, they're standards, those kinds of songs. And so what happened was in 1988, 89, we were introduced, and I had told him when I was a student at USC, I had written an early draft of a show called Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And so he took me under his wing and taught me so much more about life than he did writing. But even what he taught me about life, I think, seeped into my writing. And so Jekyll and Hyde was the first show I ever wrote, professionally. And I wrote it at first at USC in 1980, and then I met Leslie in 1988, and the show got on in 1989-90 in Houston, Texas. And it was so successful that they had riots at the theater, and some people broke the door one day to try to get in. And then it got to Broadway in 1997. So It took 17 years from the time I created it when I was your age, I was a student, to the time it got to Broadway. And so anyway, the early 90s, you know, I had done the show, and it started getting attention. I was still doing pop music, but I saw that that was changing. And then the show that Leslie won the Academy Award for is called Victor Victoria. Does anybody know Victor Victoria, that movie? You don't know it. And it stars Julie Andrews. You know who Julie Andrews is? Okay, Julie Andrews was Mary Poppins. She was My Fair Lady, Sound of Music. I mean, she was the biggest theater star in the world for a long, long time. Anyway, they were making a musical of Victor Victoria, the movie, on stage, on Broadway. And it was 1996, the year before Jekyll and Hyde. And I got a phone call. I was on my farm. I have a horse farm upstate in New York. And I was writing one day, and a beautiful English voice on the phone says, "Hello, Frank." And she introduced herself as Julie Andrews, and she was a fan and wanted me to write for her, for Victor Victoria. I thought it was a friend who does imitation of Julie Andrews. And so I said, "Natalie, I know it's you," and I hung up the phone. And I went back to work. Well, at least some people are laughing, so you get the story. Very good. And so, about 10 minutes later, the phone rang again, and it was Julie Andrews, and she said, "Please, don't hang up. It really is me." And what had happened was Leslie had written Victor Victoria with the late, great Henry Mancini. Henry Mancini was the composer. You know Henry's work because you know the Pink Panther. Henry wrote that. He wrote Moon River, one of the greatest songs ever. It was my first dance at my wedding. Amazing. And he got ill, and he wasn't able to finish the score of Victor Victoria. So for some reason, I got very, very lucky, and they asked me to finish the score. So my first experience on Broadway was writing the 11 o'clock, or for those who don't know, that's the big number at the end of the show for Julie Andrews called Living in the Shadows. And that was my beginning of Broadway. It was in 96. And then a miracle happened. 97 was Jekyll and Hyde, ran for almost 5 years. 98 was The Scarlet Pimpernel, ran for 3 years. 99 was The Civil War, ran for 3 years. And the next thing I knew, I was the first American in 50 years to have 3 shows running on Broadway at the same time. And I mean, you know, I'm not gonna lie to you, that was pretty cool. You know, that was like a time when I used to feel like I owned New York.